talking to Muslims online will be asked, how can you believe that 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1? Muslims are so incredibly proud of this objection that they post it over and over and over again. 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1, right? 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1, Christians answer. Christianity, God is 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. Islam, 1 equals 1. Y'all should take a hit at the Islamic belief of one God. If you do, I know it would just be a bunch of lies saying no, 1 is not equal to 1. Christian in school taking a test, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3. Pass. Christian in church for 2,000 years before God, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. Fail. Double standard. But you believe 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. Speak now. Don't post a comment, then make it funny. You lying. When you say 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1, that means either you're lying or you're illiterate. Which one is it? 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1 in Trinity. I think you say 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. That's the problem. Islam is very simple. One Allah and many prophets. Christian, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1. Mathematical mockery, 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 1, is by far the most common Muslim objection to the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, when Muslims post this objection, Christians often respond with some basic mathematics. They point out that 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. Or, if the Muslim demands that we use addition when we're talking about God, Christians will point out that the God of the Bible, unlike the God of the Quran, is infinite. So it would be more accurate to say infinity plus infinity plus infinity equals infinity. I'd like to help our Muslim friends with their math skills by stressing something even more basic. When we learn math in school, we learn to use numbers in an abstract manner. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 what? Well, it doesn't matter. We're using the numbers by themselves without referring to specific objects. But if you're adding up things in the real world, you need to include units, inches, pounds, jelly beans, whatever, and the units need to be the same on both sides of the equal sign. If you're adding up blocks, then 2 blocks plus 2 blocks equal 4 blocks. If you take 1,000 blocks and use them to build one house, you wouldn't say that 1 plus 1 plus 1 all the way up to 1,000 equals 1, even though the 1,000 blocks do make one house. If you made one house out of 1,000 blocks and someone said, LOL, this guy thinks that 1,000 equals 1, you'd probably want to explain how units work in math. If the units you're adding are blocks, you can't change the units to house in the answer and then take out all the units and pretend that 1,000 equals 1. If you do, you'll end up with a mathematical absurdity. Consider a few simple examples of what happens when you don't clarify which units you're using. How old was Aisha when Muhammad consummated the marriage with her? She was 9 years old. But wait a minute. How could Aisha be 9 if there was only one of her? Are Muslims telling us that 9 equals 1? Are they telling us that 1 plus 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 1 equals 1? Is this how math works in Islam? This would be a silly objection, wouldn't it? Why? Because when we talk about one Aisha, we're talking about one being, one little girl. But when we're talking about her age, 9, we're talking about something completely different. If you conveniently leave out the fact that we're talking about very different features of Aisha, her nature versus her age, you end up with mathematical absurdities. Here's another proof that, according to Islam, 9 equals 1. Sahih al-Bukhari, 5068. Narrated Anas, the Prophet used to go round, have sexual relations with all his wives in one night, and he had 9 wives. So, each of Muhammad's 9 wives could say that she had sex with Muhammad during one of these sexathons. And yet, sex with 9 different wives somehow added up to one night of sex for the Prophet of Islam. So, according to Islam, 1 plus 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 1 equals 1. But it gets worse. Sahih al-Bukhari, 268. Narrated Qatada, Anas bin Malik said, the Prophet used to visit all his wives in a round during the day and night, and they were 11 in number. 11 in number? I thought it was 9. So now 11 equals 9 and 9 equals 1. I'm confused. I asked Anas, had the Prophet the strength for it? Meaning, did Muhammad have the sexual strength to handle 11 women and girls in a single night? Anas replied, we used to say that the Prophet was given the strength of 30 men. And Sa'id said, on the authority of Qatada, that Anas had told him about 9 wives only, not 11. So, Muhammad had the sexual strength of 30 men. This means that we can add up the sexual strength of one man, and the sexual strength of another man, and the sexual strength of another man, until we get the sexual strength of 30 men. And it will equal the sexual strength of one Prophet Muhammad. So, 1 plus 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 1 equals 1 in Islam, right? Now, these are just some goofy examples to illustrate the utter ridiculousness of claiming that when someone says that something is 1 in one way, but more than 1 in another way, he's actually saying that 3 or 9 or 11 or 30 equals 1 mathematically. Here our Muslim friends may reply, but David, we're not talking about Aisha. We're not talking about Muhammad's sex life. We're talking about God. Funny, I thought we were talking about math. But I hear you. Let's talk about your God. According to Islam, Allah has literal body parts. Lots of Muslims don't know this, but their scholars do. Their scholars will admit that Allah has a literal shin, a face, a foot, or 2 feet, depending on whom you ask, 2 right hands, and so on.
So Allah described in the Quran that He has a face.
Allah mentioned that we made Adam by our hands.
Allah described in the Quran that He has 2 hands.
The hadith says very clearly that both His hands are right.
We believe that both of the hands of Allah are what? كِلْتَا يَدَيْهِ يَمِينٌ. Both of them are right. How? I don't know.
The saq here refers to Allah's shin. So He has a leg.
Surah Qalam, Surah number 68, ayat number 42. The shin of Allah is mentioned.
Allah says in Surah Al-Qalam that on the day of judgment, Allah Azza wa Jal would uplift and show His leg.
If you read Sahih al-Bukhari, the fingers of Allah are mentioned.
The Prophet tells us that Allah Azza wa Jal has fingers.
The Quran says that Allah has one eye, and another ayah says He has multiple eyes.
Allah tells us about Himself subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has an eye.
So all these are a direct indication that Allah has got a shape.
They'll just qualify this by saying that we can't comprehend Allah's shin, face, foot, or feet, right hands, and so on, because nothing is like Allah. So, how many incomprehensible but literal body parts does Allah have? Let's say it's 10. You see where I'm going with this, don't you? Allah is one in one way, but more than one in another way. He's one on the level of being, but more than one on the level of body parts. Following the method that Muslims use, then, we would say that Allah's body parts add up to one Allah, which means that if Allah has 10 body parts, 1 plus 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 1 equals 1. But Allah gets even more confusing because Allah is more than one, not just in body parts, but in other kinds of attributes. Allah has 99 names. So He's one in nature, but 99 in name, which means that 99 equals 1 in Islam. Allah's 99 names correspond to 99 attributes, and Allah's attributes can be in conflict with one another, as we read in Sunan Ibn Majah 4295. It was narrated from Abu Huraira that the Messenger of Allah said, "When Allah created the universe, He decreed for Himself, 'My mercy prevails over my wrath.'" Allah's attribute of mercy is in conflict with His attribute of wrath, but His mercy triumphs over His wrath. This means that Allah's mercy is not the same thing as His wrath. There are distinctions within the nature of Allah. So Allah is one in one way, essence or being or nature, but He's more than one in another way. He's more than one in attribute. But when Christians say that God is one in one way, essence or being or nature, but more than one in another way, more than one in person, our Muslim friends tell us that we're bad at math. Well, if we're bad at math, then Muhammad was really, really bad at math. Now, we talked about Allah. What about the Quran? How many surahs are there in the Quran? That depends on which Quran we go to. Muhammad's companion Abdullah ibn Masud only had 111 surahs in his Quran. Muhammad's companion Ubay ibn Ka'b had 116 surahs in his Quran. The Quran that Muslims use today is descended from the one that was put together by Zayd ibn Thabit, and the Zayd ibn Thabit edition had 114 surahs. But there's only one Quran, right? So, 111 equals 114 equals 116 in Islam? That's weird. But let's just stick with the Zayd ibn Thabit edition. There are 114 surahs in Zayd's Quran. 114 surahs, one Quran. So, 1 plus 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 1 equals 1 according to Islam. Things get more interesting when we think about the nature of those surahs. What is a surah of the Quran? What is Surah 2, for instance? What is its nature? You Muslims will say that its nature is the Quran or that it's the speech of Allah. So, different surahs of the Quran share that same nature, don't they? They all share the same nature as the eternal speech of Allah, don't they? Okay, let's think about this. Is Surah 1 identical to Surah 2? Is Surah 2 identical to Surah 3? Surah 1 is distinct from Surah 2, isn't it? Surah 2 is distinct from Surah 3, isn't it? And yet, their nature, what they are, is the same, because they're all the Quran, or the speech of Allah. So, Surah 1 is the Quran. Surah 2 is the Quran. Surah 3 is the Quran. But Surah 1 is not Surah 2. Surah 2 is not Surah 3. Surah 3 is not Surah 1. You Christians who are watching may recognize this as an illustration of the concept of the Trinity. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. But the Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit is not the Father. Our Muslim friends tell us that this is impossible, and yet we can use the same illustration for the Quran. The only difference is that if we wanted to be accurate, we'd need a figure with 114 sides, and there's no way I'm drawing that. Way too complicated. Now, if each of the 114 surahs is the Quran, are there 114 Qurans? I thought there was only one Quran. It seems that Muslims believe that the Quran is one in essence or nature, but 114 in surah or chapter. The Quran is one in one way, but more than one in another way. But with all the Muslim mockery of the Trinity, I thought it was impossible to be one in one way, but more than one in another way. What about the 7 ahruf? According to Muhammad, the Quran was revealed in 7 ahruf, 7 different modes or forms. Muslims today claim that this simply refers to different dialects, but there's no way this is just different dialects because people who spoke the same dialect were reciting different ahruf. What are the different ahruf? Sad story. No one knows. But whatever the 7 different modes or forms are, there's only one Quran, right? So the Quran is one in essence or being or nature, but 7 in mode or form. What about the 10 official qira'at, the 10 different recitations or readings of the Quran? The different qira'at contain different Arabic letters and different Arabic words, and this led to differences in the text of the Quran in different parts of the world.
Today, most Muslims read the Quran in a text that is referred to as the Egyptian edition of 1924 to Muslims in general. This is just simply the Quran. But this is not the only text of the Quran that is read throughout the world.
In other words, if you were to compare 2 printed Qurans, you're going to see differences between them. And when we say the various different ways to recite the Quran, we are not talking about different voices or different styles. We're talking about slight differences in pronunciations, slight differences in letters, slight differences in harakat.
In North Africa, there is a slightly different text that is based on a slightly different reading. And then too, in some parts of Africa, there is another reading of the Quran and a matching manuscript that is prevalent.
They recite the Quran in a slightly different way. Not just a voice or not just a speaking style, but also changes in letters and words and harakat.
Sometimes the different words give the verses different meanings. Sometimes the different words lead to contradictory meanings. Gets even worse because there are multiple versions of the different qira'at. And yet there's only one Quran, right? So, the 10 different qira'at with different Arabic letters and different Arabic words and different meanings are somehow only one Quran, aren't they? This means that, according to Islam, 1 plus 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 1 equals 1. And each of these readings really is the Quran, isn't it? Let's consider 3 different versions. The Hafs version is the Quran. The Warsh version is the Quran. The Al-Duri version is the Quran. But the Hafs version isn't the Warsh version. The Warsh version isn't the Al-Duri version. The Al-Duri version isn't the Hafs version. And yet, there's only one Quran. So, the Quran is 1 in essence, 7 in ahruf, 10 in qira'at, and 114 in surah. Hence, according to Islam, 1 equals 7 equals 10 equals 114. Here our Muslim friends might object, but David, we're only raising this objection because you say that there are 3 persons in the Trinity. It's impossible for 3 persons to be one in essence or nature. Is it now? Let's see if your prophet agrees with you. In Sahih Muslim 1874, Muhammad tells his followers, "Recite the Quran, for it will come on the day of resurrection, interceding for its companions. Recite the 2 bright ones, Surat Al-Baqarah and Surat Al-Imran, For they will come on the day of resurrection as if they were two clouds, or as if they were two shadows, or as if they were two flocks of birds in ranks, pleading on behalf of their companions. Notice, it will come, the Quran will come, interceding for its companions. But individual surahs will also come as flocks of birds pleading on behalf of Muslims. So, the Quran as a whole intercedes, but individual surahs also intercede. They speak, they intercede, they plead. Other surahs of the Quran will intercede as well. In Sunan Abu Dawud 1400, Muhammad says that another surah of the Quran, Surah 67, will intercede on behalf of its companion until he is forgiven. Since Muhammad tells us that multiple surahs of the Quran act as personal agents, I think it's safe to conclude that all of the surahs of the Quran act as personal agents, unless our Muslim friends want to convince us that some surahs are personal agents while others aren't, which would suggest that different surahs actually have different natures. But notice, if all of the surahs of the Quran act as personal agents, speaking and interceding and pleading, then there are 114 personal agents within the Quran, and yet the Quran also acts as a single personal agent. Sunan Ibn Majah 3781. The Quran will come on the day of resurrection like a pale man, and will say, I am the one that kept you awake at night and made you thirsty during the day. According to Muhammad, there are 114 personal agents in the Quran. They speak, they intercede, they plead. But the Quran appears as a single pale man, a single personal agent. 114 persons in a single pale man? That's got to be a record. So, here again, 114 equals 1 in Islam. Try to get your mind around this. Allah's speech is eternal. That eternal speech is also personal. It appears as a man, speaking and interceding. But within the one nature of that eternal personal speech, there are 114 personal agents that speak and intercede and plead. Now, let me ask all my Muslim friends out there, what was your objection to the mathematics of the Trinity? Why do you keep saying that the Trinity is irrational and absurd? What was your objection to the claim of Jesus and the apostles and the prophets that God is one in one way, but more than one in another way? If you insist, as you keep doing, that the doctrine of the Trinity must be rejected because it leads to mathematical absurdities, well then, we have no choice but to reject your God, your prophet, and your book for producing so many mathematical absurdities. Tell me, why is it that the absolute dumbest objections to Christianity, 1 + 1 + 1 = 1 in Trinity, become the most popular Muslim objections to Christianity? Do you really want to know, my Muslim friends? It's because you serve the single most obvious false prophet in history. And that 7th century Arabian caravan robber you call your prophet contradicts the teachings of the most indisputably reliable and trustworthy and miraculous person in history, Jesus Christ. Your scholars and apologists don't want you thinking about the unmistakable differences between Jesus and Muhammad. So they fill your heads with laughably stupid objections to Christianity, along with lies about your prophet, to keep you distracted. Your Creator, the Creator of the universe, revealed something about his eternal nature. He revealed it through Jesus Christ, the apostles, and the true prophets. And you mock what he revealed because you'd rather believe the most obvious false prophet in history and the scholars and Dawagandists who constantly lie to you to keep you in a state of ignorance. If you still don't believe me, when I tell you that your scholars and Dawagandists are trying to keep you in a state of ignorance, just ask yourself, why is it that most of the information David just shared with me in this video is information that I will only hear from David and maybe from some other Christians or a few atheists, but never from Muslim scholars and apologists, even though it comes from Islam's most trusted sources? If your scholars and apologists are hiding this from you, what else are they hiding?
Yeah, well, obviously Islam's central article is Tawheed, the idea that Allah is absolutely one. And when Muslims advance this notion, they usually speak of it as if it precludes any notion of plurality in Allah. Now, really, that has to be the meaning, that it excludes any kind of plurality. I don't mean just a plurality of persons, but any kind of plurality in Allah's being. Because according to the Quran, when it rejects the Trinity, it pits this against the notion of Allah's unity. That means that unless the Quran is wrong about the Trinity, then that has to be the notion that it's objecting to when it asserts Allah's unity. And so when you consider that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is not a belief in that God has, that the persons of the Trinity are simply parts of God. Rather, the persons of the Trinity each share the entirety of the divine essence, right? That's the mystery that's involved in the Trinity. That it's not like human beings where one human being is a particular instance of human nature, right? And then another human being is another instantiation of human nature. Rather, we say all three persons partake of or possess entirely the divine nature. And so what Muslims are objecting to is not the notion that there is a plurality of gods, although they do object to that, and they often confuse the Trinity for that. But for the Quran not to be an error, it has to be objecting also to the notion that there is plurality within God, right? Not just that there's a one being next to another being next to another being. And this was brought out to me through reading all sorts of Islamic sources. In fact, the Shiite sources and the Mu'tazili sources are especially strong here because they actually say that. They'll say that Allah doesn't even have a plurality of attributes. And they chide their Sunni counterparts or antagonists, however you want to view them. They charge them with being guilty of shirk because they believe Allah has a plurality of attributes. And so just those sorts of things started getting me thinking about this. And there were some other things tied into it as well. But I just realized there's something at least initially curious about Allah speaking in the plural. But even if you accept the idea that it's a plural of majesty, which I'm going to show is not true, but even if you accept that, why would Muslims who think that Allah is absolutely one associate plurality with majesty, right? Why think that way if you're a Muslim? If Allah is absolutely one and there's no one more majestic than Allah, then you would think that the appropriate way to express that would be simply in terms that communicate unicity or his exclusivity, his being sole or alone. But no, they say the opposite. They say that plurality bespeaks majesty. Now, I quite agree with that. I do believe the notion of plurality bespeaks fullness, richness, majesty. But then I'm a Trinitarian, and that sort of thinking makes sense to me. But I do believe that ultimately the explanation is that for why Muhammad employs this way of speaking in the Quran for Allah is that he picked it up from Jews and Christians like a dog picks up fleas. A dog doesn't know where it gets these fleas, right? It doesn't know where they come from. It's just strolling along and the fleas jump on it. Well, Muhammad overheard Jews and Christians. Again, I'm just throwing this out there so you have an idea. But he's overhearing Jews and Christians recite their scriptures, and he hears God speaking in the plural. Muhammad overheard this kind of speaking when he heard the Jews and Christians reciting. Let me just recite or give you a hadith here as an example. This is from Sahih al-Bukhari, 6944, or it's in other editions, book 89, hadith number 5. This is just to establish that Muhammad overheard Jews and Christians reciting things. It says, narrated Abu Huraira, while we were in the mosque, Allah's messenger came out to us and said, let us proceed to the Jews. So we went along with him till we reached Bayat al-Midras, a place where the Torah used to be recited and all the Jews of the town used to gather. Okay, so not only were the pagans reciting their poetry, not only was Muhammad reciting his putative revelations, but the Jews were reciting the Torah. And then elsewhere in the Hadith literature, you hear that the Christians did the same sort of thing. This was a common thing, especially in an oral culture. It wasn't distinctive to Islam. So my claim, at least initially here, is that Muhammad overheard this sort of thing. He started to use it when giving his revelations, assuming it just to be the way God speaks. And later, when he's challenged on it, he's flummoxed. He doesn't know how to deal with this. Here's, for example, a quote from Ibn Taymiyyah, who's known as the Sheikh of Islam, at least to Salafi Muslims. But he says the view of the Salaf, that's the early generations of Muslims, the view of the Salaf of this Ummah and of its Imams and later generations is that the Prophet heard the Quran from Jibreel, and Jibreel heard it from Allah. The use of plural forms in such phrases is the style of Arabic speech used to refer to one who is of high standing and has helpers who obey him. So here you get the impression from Ibn Taymiyyah that he's saying Allah employs this plurality language because he's including Jibreel and Muhammad as his helpers in this language. Now, the problem with that is, among other things, while you might be able to find statements of the Quran that use plural speech that could seemingly comport with that, agree with that, there are many uses of we and us and our and so forth that don't admit of that kind of understanding, if for no other reason than that Allah speaks as we to the angels and as we to Muhammad.
It says glory. Now, if Allah is speaking, look how Allah is speaking right now in this verse. Again, chapter 17, verse 1. Glory be to him who made his servant to go on a night from the sacred mosque to the remote mosque. Notice Allah is speaking about himself right now. And then it says, of which we have blessed the precincts so that we may show to him some of our signs. Surely he is hearing and seeing. Look how many ways Allah spoke about himself, basically, if he is Allah that's speaking. Otherwise, we have at least three persons involved in this whole conversation.
Actually, so think about this. When Allah uses the plural, it's plural, right? It's not dual. There's a dual in Arabic, right? So this has to mean at least three or more, right? When he speaks in the plural. That's correct?
That's correct. I'm muting myself. Yes.
Yeah. Correct. So my point here is, so you have Allah speaking in the plural, but he also speaks about Allah in the third person.
That's right. That's like we've seen here.
Yeah. So now you have at least four persons. Allah's, and even if you try and take the plural as somehow a singular referent, he's still talking about Allah. So you still have a two persons. Now, some people might try and say this is just Iliism, and if it was, to me, the problem with that sort of thing, Iliism means when one person talks about himself. You can do that. There are certain contexts where it makes sense to do that. But Allah does this far too often. If nothing else, Allah, by talking this way, sure hasn't, done what he claims to do in giving a perfectly eloquent Quran, right? It's certainly not a model of eloquence. It's quite dizzying and confusing, whether you can account for its meaning or not. It's not very intelligible, or one. And, many years ago, I was reading, actually, it's kind of funny now that I think about it. The phenomena that we were just talking about, where Allah switches from speaking in the first person to speaking in the third person, that's referred to as iltifat, right? It's considered by Muslims now a piece of beautiful rhetoric, right? Employed masterfully in the Quran. We look at it and say it's gibberish. Muslims are obligated to say, oh, it's so beautiful how Allah, can't consistently speak in the first person or third person, even in the same sentence, right? And M.A.S. Abdel Halim made this statement that I want to read for you. Here's what he says. He says it should be pointed out that in pre-Islamic literature and during the time of the revelation of the Quran, pronouns do not appear to have been used as indicative of status. Okay? They did not change with social status, and the plural of majesty in particular does not appear to have been used by or for addressing or referring to kings or chiefs. The prophet and his early successors did not use it for themselves, nor in their letters to address kings or governors. Okay?
Yeah, that would have been a perfect example, right? I mean, if that was in use.
Yeah. Yeah, he wrote to the king of Abyssinia, other occasions. Supposedly, he wrote to all the kings right before his death and told them all to submit to Islam. But we don't find that, according to MAS Abdel Halim, we don't find that as a feature of Arabic prior to the time of Muhammad or at the time of Muhammad. So he claims this is something that was introduced with the Quran. Allah alone came up with this. What else would you expect a Muslim to think, right? This is entirely heaven sent. Allah uniquely speaks this way. Now, it's kind of humorous because even if we say the plural of majesty didn't exist in Arabic, I think most people would say it did exist in other cultures. Somebody else can do the work, the footwork on that to see if that's true. But it's not surprising that a Muslim would like to claim that Allah is the one who came up with this, right? De novo. But now here's the issue that this raises. Did you want to interject?
I was just going to say, this is yet another example and proof that Muhammad was influenced by the Jews. That's the only explanation for it.
Right. So here's what I started thinking after reading that article by MAS Abdel Halim. I started thinking, okay, if it wasn't, because a lot of times Muslims will say it's just Arabic, right? Like, I understand that contemporary Muslims are now comfortable with this, right? It makes sense for them to just understand this as a plural of majesty. But the issue is, now that you realize it wasn't part of Arabic grammar at the time, it wasn't how they spoke, then the question becomes, how did anybody that first heard the Quran understand this unless it was explained to them, or unless the Quran in some way indicates the meaning of this plural language, right? Because otherwise it's just inexplicable. It's an enigma. And how can that be in Allah's perspicuous book, right? It's supposed to be perfectly clear. So here, though, I realized, if that wasn't part of Arabic grammar at the time or usage, then how does anybody know this is a plural of majesty, right? Unless Muhammad explains it or Allah explains it, or I would grant that you could also show this is how it's consistently used in the Quran. So let me read for you some statements from Muslims that are going to help us to see if this is the case. This is a statement from Sheikh Karamali. You might be familiar with him, I don't know. But Sheikh Karamali says, when he, Allah, uses nahnu, we, to refer to himself, nahnu is the royal we and connotes majesty. Someone steeped in the Quranic language will feel humbled before the divine majesty when reciting such verses. This humbleness in the essence of worship, which defines the relationship between servant and master. Verses that speak of resurrection and judgment, for example, have a powerful aura of divine majesty. Okay, so now think about this. If it's the plural of majesty, you would expect the Quran to use the plural when it's speaking in some sense of Allah's majesty, and as seen in its connection with things like judgment or resurrection. That's what Karamali is saying. Okay, now he introduces the usage of I. It refers to Allah's closeness, his nearness, his forgiveness, and we represents his anger, his wrath, his fury, his majesty, right? So according to these scholars, when Allah uses I, it refers to these beautiful things like his love, his care, his forgiveness, all these sweet sounding things. But when it's talking about Allah's transcendence, his wrath, his anger, his fury, his judgment, it uses language like we. Okay, so this allows us to test the theory. Okay, Remember, Allah doesn't explain it in the Quran. Muhammad doesn't explain it in the Hadith. It's not a part of Arabic language at the time. So we have to look at Quranic usage. Does the Quran use these terms in this way? I for his immanence, his nearness, his closeness, his care, his love, and we for his majesty, anger, wrath, and all of that. Well, it might on a handful of occasions, but I can show you dozens and dozens and dozens of times where it does precisely the opposite. In fact, I can show times where it uses I and we in the same context to talk about Allah's wrath, and I and we in the same context to talk about things like his love, his care, and his forgiveness.